T-10 to showtime. On my mark, roll intro and mark. Camera's ready. Camera 1 check. Camera 2 check. Audio. Roll guest package. Action. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of Visa or the speaker's employers. This podcast is intended to provide general information and should not be considered health, legal, tax, or financial advice. Todd, coming to you in 3, 2, 1, action. Welcome to the Policy Sandbox, a collaborative space for ideation at the intersection of payments, commerce, and public policy. I'm Todd Fox, president of the Visa Economic Empowerment Institute. And in this episode, I want to take you with me backstage at the World Economic Forum in Davos. In this special episode, we'll give you a preview of the types of topics and insightful people that we will highlight in this entire series. Among others, we'll explore the latest developments in payments policy and how they interact with recent geopolitical shifts. These topics were on the top of the agenda at Davos, helping to make it the most consequential conference of its kind in decades. For the remainder of this episode, we'll help you understand why. Welcome to the Policy Sandbox. Let's dig in. I was recently at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, and I sat down with some of the smartest people I know so that I could share their insights with you. My first guest is Matthew Blake, Managing Director at the WEF Center for Financial and Monetary Systems, and one of the real thought leaders in our space. You talked about how you've been doing this for quite a while now, and I've had the privilege of working with you on a few projects. So I'm just going to take you down memory lane here, okay? Here's 2 quotes. Okay. Quote number 1. Let's see if you remember this one. The promise. Ooh. Successfully harnessing 2 opposing forces, decentralization and integration, can reinvigorate the global financial system and provide universal access to financial services to fund real economic activity, manage wealth, and diversify risks. Enhanced financial inclusion could facilitate a downhill flow of capital and reduced reliance on debt financing. A well-functioning financial system is our best hope to solve the global structural transformation challenges. That's from the Global Financial and Monetary System in 2030 report that you did back in 2018.
Okay.
Here's the second quote. This one may be a little more familiar. The multilateral system is under pressure. Declining trust, diminishing transparency, and respect for the rule of law, along with heightened protectionism, are threatening long-standing international relations, trade, and investment, and increasing the propensity for conflict. Geoeconomic confrontation is top of mind for respondents and was selected as the top risk most likely to trigger a material global crisis in 2026. And of course, spoiler alert, that's from the 2026 top risk report.
Yeah.
What went wrong?
I think it's a really complicated question to answer. I think there are a lot of factors at play. One is a breakdown in trust. It's not necessarily specific to the financial system. In fact, I was thinking about this, and it's a bit of a paradox. When I go to bed at night, I'm not thinking about my bank account, whether or not it's going to be there in the morning. I mean, maybe I should. There's a lot of risk out there, cyber risk, getting hacked. I mean, these are real concerns. But that's not a top consideration of mine when I go to sleep. Nor is it when I, buy something and I use your excellent rails and sort of the plumbing of the financial system to consummate that transaction. I don't think twice about it. But I do think there is a deterioration, unfortunately, in institutions, in expertise, and in many of the things that maintain a level of order and structure to society. Why is that? So I think what's been written there and what you described are symptoms. Mm-hmm. They're symptoms of a larger challenge, and one that's probably driven by, technological factors, a lot of information out there, a lot of misinformation. People inherently seek to try to synthesize. I think that's part of being a human being, make sense of complex things, creates simplicity around it. But it's a complicated world.
One of the things that happens when trust breaks down is you have more fragmentation. And few people have done more to really give
some shape and taxonomy to this trend around fragmentation than you and the team at the World Economic Forum. You published a report 12 months ago that really tried to take stock of fragmentation, maybe put some ideas out there into the ether, and even a little bit more than the ether. You actually got some amazing people around the table to talk about it last year. Catch us up on fragmentation. This is still a huge priority, I know, for you, and certainly for us as well. How are the conversations this week about fragmentation in the global financial system?
I think it's one of the most, at least this past week, it's been an extremely prominent discussion point. I was trying to think of an apt metaphor to describe, sort of synthesize what this thing is, and I don't know that's the best one, but in my mind I have like a set of interconnected gears, right? So let's assume that that's the global financial system, and there are big gears and there are small gears, and you think about the teeth that are intermeshed and this thing is moving around. And so fragmentation, depending on the severity of the example, I guess, could be described as perhaps either throwing some grit in the gears or perhaps removing a gear or two, right?
That's right.
So what are we talking about? I mean, one of the hypotheses, and this is going back 2.5 years now, okay? We, like you, we talk to a lot of people. I have a great role, as we started with, 300 financial institutions, all from different orientations, parts of the world, businesses. And you talk with the CEOs, you talk with the C-suite, and they tell you what's working and they tell you what's not. And so we started to hear frequently about concerns. If you're an asset manager, it's like, I'm worried that maybe governments are going to be playing a more active role in how I allocate capital on behalf of my client.
Yeah.
If I'm talking to a payment provider, it might be, in certain jurisdictions, I'm hearing discussions about more nationalized payment systems, right? Payment rails, like Brazil might be an example of that. You know that space better than I do, but I'll just cite it. If you're a bank, it's consistently been, how do I operate as a global institution with so many different regulatory regimes? I mean, Bill Winters, I caught part of his discussion on tokenization the other day. It was in the public domain. It's a great panel to watch. You can stream it. He says, I'm in like 120 countries and I'm dealing with like 60, 70 different regulatory things. Like, how do you make sense of that? So some of these features have always been there. But I think it's a question of so there's always been a bit of grit in the gears.
Right.
But now I think the grit factor is going up. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a function of a changing paradigm globally, like in terms of power and world order. And these are words that I've heard frequently deployed this week. I think those are serious words. When you hear people talking about power,
right,
like, stop, all right. We're an institution for public-private cooperation. Yeah, there are power dynamics, but we're trying to move everybody in the same direction together. I'm not sure the way it's been defined this week is a collaborative exercise, right? So these are important forces. But anyway, I heard all of these different symptoms of an issue, and it took us some time to sort of patch the pieces together because, again, the orientation from different stakeholders and the way they articulated it was different and nuanced. So over time, we sort of landed on this notion of a system that is becoming more fragmented. We started to use that terminology, started to get used more regularly. I'm not saying we coined the terminology, I just think that's the word that captured it. And since then, as you alluded to, we spent time building a committee of very senior CEOs and some policy voices and academic voices from different parts of the world. And we have over 30 very prestigious folks who joined us on this, and they were part of that cohort that we spoke to that said, yeah, I get what you're saying, Matthew and team, we're experiencing that. And what we aimed to do was two things. One, we tried to describe it. We didn't use the gears metaphor, but maybe we should have. I don't know if it's the right one, but we did try to put some words around it. And we also stepped back and recognized more explicitly that the global financial system, as human beings, it's one of the most integrated systems
That's right.
that we've ever created. If I need to get a transaction to a Brazilian merchant, buy some chairs or something, I do it. Mm-hmm. Like, people are connected in that way. Is the system perfect? It's not. Mm-hmm. But it works well and it's been tested, right?
What was the big takeaway from the 2026 annual meeting?
three words maybe to describe the future financial system.
Yes.
One is contested. Second is digital. And I do think there's a really interesting sort of regionalization angle. Now, that word, what's implied there are coalitions of the willing. All right, and I think we're seeing some manifestations of greater regional collaboration. Because of the moment, Europe is a test case of this, where you have renewed energy to try to solve some of the structural challenges within the EU from a financial perspective, energy, technology, et cetera, just the competitiveness overall. That's been a multi-year discussion, to put it diplomatically. But I think there's added exigency at this point in time. And there are other parts of the world, too, that are looking to work together. And then there's the realpolitik thing, which we were talking before, where you will have mid-sized countries that are important looking to broker deals with some of the larger countries out there, like a China, US, on much more of a bilateral basis, focused on a set of collective interests where there's a win-win dynamic. And so I think that's, in that regional, I sort of dissect that word a bit because it's not just to be interpreted purely
That's right.
that. So
That's right.
Yeah.
Sort of Mark Carney's concept of these flexible coalitions when we are aligned in values and purpose. It may not be the same cluster of countries, but we may come together in interesting combinations.
Yeah.
What Matthew just articulated is something that has been on my mind for quite a while. How is it possible that the financial system is becoming more fragmented, fractured, more contested, while simultaneously becoming more digitally interconnected than ever before? It's a paradox. But one of my dear friends has thought deeply about this paradox for many years. Professor Yeshe Yadav is professor of law and associate dean at Vanderbilt Law School, and we spoke on this topic in Davos.
You do something very special. You're kind of a professor, but kind of much more than that. Explain your role in this world.
I have absolutely no idea what that role is because it seems to be evolving over time. I kind of see it as professional nerdery in a field that is constantly evolving. So even if you do research and you spend all of your time in the books, it doesn't really get you to where you need to go, which is understanding how this tech works. So you have to spend a ton of time with the people that actually build the tech, the people that actually are thinking about legislating on how some of that tech ought to work and the risks and benefits of it. And then ultimately the people who are going to use that tech, right? The people who are the end users who might be thinking about what this technology really means for them, but ultimately, you know, they're wondering whether it's going to meet a need for them in their lives. So I guess what I get to do as a professor, which is super cool, is get to be part of all of these different conversations, and then hopefully translate a conversation from one group to another, to another, to another, and then get to go home and do a lot of Netflix. So that seems to be the life trajectory at the minute.
Well, there's another role you play, and I don't know if you even realize this, but for policy people like me that are trying to make sense of this whole intersecting world of law and innovation, you really influence the way we see the world and really kind of informs the way we do our jobs.
I'm shocked.
And I want to tell you, and I'll give you a very specific example of this. So in 2017, you wrote a paper, and I think it's called something like Financial Innovation and the Policy Trilemma. I may be getting the title slightly wrong.
It's with Chris Brummer.
Okay,
in fact,
I've heard of him.
You've heard of him. The fintech and the innovation trilemma.
Right, yeah. And this basically says that public authorities can have any two of the following three things, but they can't have all three.
Exactly.
They can have market integrity.
Right.
They can have a lot of financial innovation, or they can have
rules clarity.
Rules and clarity.
Yeah, the ability to make rules in a really clear and simplified and easily absorbed way.
So this framework has been like such a useful way for us to think about all the changes that have happened, and that was in 2017. So just think about bring it up to the present day. It sounds like like a lot of things of that vintage may have lost their relevance and decayed over time. This actually feels like it's more relevant now.
It's so kind of you to say.
Yeah. Well, so that's my question though. Like, in your view, if you were to write the trilemma paper now, in light of recent regulatory and political developments, like where are people landing on this trilemma? Where are different jurisdictions deciding to prioritize or deprioritize, as the case may be, so that they can get two of those three things that they want?
It's such an interesting question, Todd, because I think if we go back and we take a step back, there's two different processes that appear to be underway here, which is one, trying to have a ton of competition to get all the interesting digital assets, sort of digital public infrastructure business to their shores, to be seen as the hub that is going to be innovating and doing this interesting sort of technology build in their jurisdiction. So we see a ton of competition with that. For example, if you go to the UAE or you go to Hong Kong, you're just, even, Europe with MiCA, you're getting a lot of interest in that. And so you would think that there is an emphasis on innovation plus, trying to have very clear rules for the industry, which, invariably means that from the trilemma side, we're having to pay attention to market integrity issues, right? That we really have to think about that. Now, in some other countries, and I would argue that at least until recently, the USA was one of them, right? The emphasis was slightly different, right? Which was we're going to have very clear rules. You're just not going to be able to do it. Right? We're going to do it to protect market integrity, which is we think that, crypto or digital asset markets might impinge on the financial system or, contaminate the banking markets or whatever. And that invariably meant that financial innovation in the form of digital assets or public infrastructure was ultimately, having to work harder to grow. But what's interesting now is that has shifted in the US. It's a very, immediate pivot to having I would say having a very open posture to innovation in this area, clear rules to the extent that the enforcement pressure has really dialed down immensely across federal agencies. But, what's interesting here ultimately is that we're dealing with a situation in which all of the jurisdictions around the world are not being able to converge on common standards. Right? So, where we ultimately end up in this matrix, the kinds of pressures that we get to, understand how this technology eventually works so we have good rules for them, the global community has not come together because that first dynamic, the competition, has ultimately led to people thinking, we're keeping these good ideas to ourselves. We're not being able to collaborate. And so different countries are doing their own thing with different versions of the trilemma ultimately manifesting in their regulatory system. So it's really hard to tell, how this is ultimately going to land at the global level. Right now, it seems super fragmented.
Well, you just said the magic word. So we've had conversations throughout the week here in Davos and even on this podcast about how fragmentation is sort of making its way through the global financial system and some of the unintended consequences of that. We talked to Matthew Blake from the World Economic Forum. He's led a really exciting piece of work around the navigation of the financial system, fragmentation phenomenon. We've talked to other experts, Josh Lipsky from the Atlantic Council, Daniel Tannenbaum from Oliver Wyman. And we're all working on this fragmentation concept. And it occurred to me that there's a dimension to the fragmentation, which is actually really more your framework. And so this innovation trilemma, when it comes to fintech at least, maybe that's actually as much of a factor in why we're in such a fragmented world, for all the reasons you just said, as this more overt effort to nationalize payment systems or separate what are heretofore connected networks into more regionalized networks. So perhaps the real source of fragmentation is at least partly explained by your paper from 2017.
Well, that's very generous of you, Todd. I think way overly generous in that regard.
So maybe that's the answer. Fragmentation is happening, at least in part, because national policymakers need to make difficult choices. They need to calibrate based on trade-offs. Of course, every government would love to have clear rules, market integrity, and a robust innovation ecosystem. The problem is, maybe you can't have all three at once. If policymakers opt for the first two, it stands to reason that the financial system would feel less connected. At the same time, jurisdictions that are choosing to prioritize innovation are finding themselves more connected than ever before. We may not have solved the mystery once and for all, but at the very least, we have a framework for thinking about these parallel trends. Later in our conversation, Yesha brings up a related point. Sometimes financial innovations are so powerful, they force us to think more systemically about the underpinnings of global finance.
I think it's interesting when we are at Davos and we are experiencing the world and we're experiencing some of the frictions that exist in it. I think one of the learnings that has come about is just, an excitement about the technology, for example, stablecoins, just how much they can achieve, but that in itself being a potential fear factor, particularly with respect to US dollar denominated stablecoins, right? Like the idea that these things are so powerful potentially, that one can send money on the internet abroad instantly for like pennies in a dollar, or to your next door neighbor for like, instantly, whereas in the US, you'd have to wait 3 days from the ACH network, or if you're gonna, do some kind of payment scheme and you wanna get it back to your bank, 3 days. That now we're seeing the potential, but then suddenly when you go abroad, people are like, look, this is such powerful technology. Does it mean that we're gonna all end up using dollars? Do we wanna do that? Do we feel comfortable doing that? What about our national currency? Well, okay, but then do we have the kind of resources that the dollar can look back to, which is like the treasury market, right? The strength of that economy, to say that we can also issue our own version of stablecoins that can then propagate and become as powerful, or at least competitive with things like the dollar, USD pegged stablecoin. So it's really interesting to see how the success of the technology, the attractiveness of it, the appeal of it, the complete mammoth potential that it has, is also something that is potentially leading to this fragmentation, because it's touching something that is so deeply ingrained in people's own political economy, which is the monetary system, right? Which is monetary sovereignty, which is the ability to think that this is ours and this is our kind of this is our walled garden that we want to be able to control. And now we have these incredible pieces of tech coming at us. How do we protect that? How do we deal with that? And it's a question that a lot of countries are trying to answer right now. But, it's leading to this fragmentation in a very global market.
Absolutely. And one of the really interesting areas where there's been some progress, but maybe not enough, is we're finally starting to see some stablecoin activity in currencies other than the US dollar.
Yeah.
What do you think is holding that back? Is it really just the lack of a regulatory framework, or is it maybe that sometimes the regulatory framework kind of disallows
really good question. It's a really good question, Todd. I mean, I think it's probably a multitude of factors. Now, we can go legally. There's no regulatory framework in many jurisdictions for stablecoins, licensing stablecoins, stablecoin issuers, and how they ought to be, handled from a risk perspective. But then again, we do have some laws. We have MiCA, right? Notwithstanding that fact, we don't have a ton of euro-denominated stablecoins just taking over the globe at the minute. We don't have that. You have South Korea that, had Japan that tried to have an issuance of their own won-denominated stablecoin. In the case of Japan, the yen-denominated stablecoin, permissioned within the regulatory environment to do that. Nevertheless, there's clear sense that, notwithstanding, people are still going to be using USDT on Tron, right? Like in that region. So notwithstanding the fact that there's a regulatory permission structure, they haven't flourished in the same way as you might expect. There's also just the fact that in the US, we didn't have a regulatory framework up until the summer. Notwithstanding that fact, we have this incredible universe of stablecoins, USD denominated, that have taken over the globe, right? Like Tether, USDC, some others certainly, but we have that, notwithstanding the lack of a permission structure. So maybe there's something else going on. In terms of what we think about when we think about stablecoins, what are they, right? It's a US dollar denominated pegged digital token. The issuer is promising, hey guys, we're going to give you the value of this US dollar no matter what. And to make sure that our promise is met, well, great, we're going to show you that we have a vat of cash and great assets to back that up. Now, in the case of USD, US dollar denominated stablecoins, we have the superpower of all superpowers. That's the US Treasury market, right? Which is we can endlessly produce short-term treasuries that can back up these promises to propagate hundreds of billions of dollars worth of USD pegged across the globe. Now, you need that because it's no currency risk for a US dollar denominated, stablecoin to rely on a US dollar denominated treasury. It's instant, it's crazy, it's awesome, it's super liquid, etc. How many countries can boast a treasury market? None. Right?
Yes.
None. No region in the EU. No Australian. No Japanese. I mean, Japan has a huge, government debt market, but it's not generative to that power. So we're in a world in which the US comes at it with a huge advantage. And so when one looks at why certain countries are succeeding and others not. Let's think about what the stablecoin actually is and what's boosting it and backing it. And almost every other jurisdiction does not have the assets to back it.
With great power comes great responsibility. It's the universal rule of superheroes. When it comes to financial superpowers, it's important to understand the origin story. As Yesha pointed out, the US dollar as the global reserve currency is an extremely important component of the global financial system. So understanding the market for US treasuries is the key to understanding the potential impact of innovation on the trade-offs made by national authorities. Besides those two in-depth conversations, I chatted with a few other friends on the ground in Davos. There were 5 items on the agenda this year, and I wanted to know which of these my fellow delegates thought was most pressing and what gives them hope that we can rise to the occasion. Here are some key moments that really resonated with me.
There were 5 global challenges on the Davos agenda this week, and I'm interested to hear from you, Dan. Which of those challenges do you think was the biggest part of your Davos experience? And what, if anything, from your conversations maybe gives you some hope that maybe progress is possible?
I'll try to end on the positive note, but the area that I've spent pretty much every waking moment this week on was everything around fragmentation, around the new trade order that Prime Minister Carney spoke of, that some of the US officials spoke of. We're really talking about alignment, but coming at it from very different perspectives. And talking to policymakers and private institutions of how do we navigate this? Like, how do we create long-term sustainable business strategies in an environment where you can't really take policy in a way that you would have historically, where the US becomes a much more unreliable trading partner? How do we plan for that? And how do we solve some of the broader crises driving fragmentation? I spent quite a bit of time on Ukraine and Ukraine-related issues because it was not nice, but helpful to get that back in the narrative again. And President Zelensky showing up on the Thursday is an important step, but we've been distracted by a lot of faux crises over the last few weeks. And I think it's really creating a cloudy environment for businesses to figure out what to do going forward.
First thing I would say is that every Davos, people come in thinking this is the most important place to be in the world. This week, I would say it actually was, given what was hammered out yesterday on Greenland. And Davos lived up to some of its hype, which is bringing global leaders together, trying to solve difficult challenges. There's been many years, we've been here before, where there's a lot of talk and little action. There was real action this year, and I think we should applaud that. Now, for me, when I think of the challenges, because I come from the Atlantic Council and I run the Geoeconomic Center, I think of the first WEF theme, which is how to cooperate more in a contested world, which is a nice euphemistic way of talking about all the problems we know we're dealing with across the world.
Absolutely.
And we did cooperate more in a contested world this week. But what was so interesting to me stepping back and thinking about the week is there's always 2 Davoses. There's business Davos. This is the core of Davos. Everyone coming here to do deals, negotiate, happens in private rooms across the city. And then there's geopolitical Davos, the leaders giving their speeches. This year they collided. The markets were moving at the beginning of the week because of what was happening over Greenland. And to me, that was Davos coming together and a reconciliation that you can't live in these siloed worlds anymore. Geopolitics affects markets. The bond market moved. The president responded to that, and markets affect geopolitics. So the hopeful thing for me is that's actually how the world works, and I think both sides of Davos recognize that coming out of this.
If you want to know why Davos is still a relevant conference after 55 years, that's why. 3 things that really stuck with me from the conversations I've shared with you today. First, in times of fragmentation, global networks become more valuable, not less. Second, trust matters. Platform shifts in commerce do not happen without trust. And finally, optionality is resilience. There have never been more ways to move money, but making these systems more interoperable will make the economy more resilient. I'm up for the challenge. What about you? What resonated with you from the conversations you heard on this episode of Policy Sandbox, or elsewhere from Davos? How will you use those realizations to make smarter decisions in the coming weeks and months? That's it for this episode. Thanks to all my guests, and for more information, visit visa.com/VEEI. See you next time.